right, good morning, everyone. We're going to wait a few minutes just to allow people to come into the room, but thank you for joining us. We'll start in just a couple of minutes. Again, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're just going to let the people who've signed up to attend this webinar to log in and join. We're just going to start in about a minute or two here. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. As we go through this webinar, there is a chat function as well as a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to ask any of our panelists a question, please put your questions in there, and I'll be happy to relay them to you as we go through the budget and describe what's in there and how it impacts policymakers and stakeholders in the atmosphere here. I think we can get going, guys. So welcome everyone to the Crestview Strategy Alberta Budget Briefing. Busy day at the legislature yesterday. It's a day where there's a whole lot of sitting around and waiting for the numbers to come, but when they come, now you got a big document to pour through. That's what our experts here have done, and we've got some great insights for you. My name's Tom Vernon. I am a communications consultant with Crestview Strategy based in Edmonton, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Alexis Sapecki, Bill Anderson, Evan Menzies, and Talisha Thorpe, no finer group of public affairs professionals to provide insights for us today into the Alberta budget. Let's just start with some of the big numbers just to give you a baseline of where this budget went. So it's a $73 billion budget total spending by the Alberta government this year. That's a 4% increase over what was forecast last year. And it does come with a surplus, but not a very big one. It's a $367 million surplus, a razor-thin surplus in this year's budget, but it does also include $2.4 billion worth of borrowing. I believe the words that the minister used were, it's a beer budget, not a champagne budget, or something to that effect. We are seeing a number of policies around renewable energy, of course, in the province moving forward, healthcare change. So a lot to dig into here. So I'm going to throw this one to Bill. He was in our pre-chat, the one that put his hand up first. So we've heard for weeks rumblings about belt tightening within government. In the end, we did see a small spending increase compared to inflation plus population growth at around 4%. Is there anything here in the fiscal policy side that should give stakeholders looking to engage with government about investments or policy changes pause? What do you see here, Bill?
Yeah, it's the first time in a little while that we've seen a government really sort of harken back to like an old-fashioned sort of conservative worldview about, analogizing the provincial budget against a household budget. And those are definitely the terms you hear Minister Horner speaking in. I think that the overarching kind of goal of this budget, which is like the first budget since the UCP were reelected last spring, is I think to put the province in a position where they can spend and make large investments responsibly. Maybe not right now. It's not a budget with a bunch of new spending commitments. Like I think, if you look at the operational budgets for health and education and advanced ed, like that's 60% of the budget right there. So I think there's definitely a focus on making sure that, key services and programs are funded. But then, when you look at the sort of longer term objectives that this government has set for themselves around trying to reestablish and recapitalize the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, when they talk about those investments in the Savings Trust Fund, they mention and then they talk about the fact that that fund can be used for long-term strategic and even one-time spends, but a lot of it has to do with I think saving so that there's money in place to really I think stabilize revenue when it comes to a transition away from oil and gas.
What's amazing to me in this budget, it's $17 billion worth of resource revenue forecast here. So it's 25% of the budget. Oil is forecast to be at $74 per barrel. So it's still, what we've seen in the last 10 years, it's still on the higher end of what we've seen. But what we're seeing is the pressures of growth. We saw more than 4% population growth last year. The pressure that puts on the systems here, 4% increase in spending, but still just that razor thin margin of $367 million. I mean, Evan, Alexa, Talisha, I'll throw to you in conversations that stakeholders want to have with governments about maybe finding investments. Do you think it's going to be a more challenging environment, or do you think there's still a desire here to find investments opportunities?
Yeah, that's a great question, Tom. As a stakeholder talking to this government looking forward now with how tight this budget is and how conservative the government will be with spending, you're going to really need to make your case, and you're going to need to be strategic in what you ask for, and you're going to need to look 3 years down the road and see, does my project, does my ask fit into their plan 3 years later? Because they're not going to be handing out checks left and right to people for projects. You're going to have to really make your case and really be thoughtful and be paying attention to future announcements, especially to see if you are fitting in line, what funding programs are available, and if you can really fit within the allocated budget.
Yeah, and I think this year, depending on the policy ask from stakeholders or funding ask, this might be the year that you focus more on policy shifts and policy changes for your organization rather than specific funding. It is one item to note, though, that in the budget, one thing I've noticed is that there are some unallocated, very broad kind of pockets of money. So look for creative ways of where you might be able to fit into those pockets of money. One piece I saw was, there's 30 million broadly allocated towards roads and bridges. So what does that look like and where could that go? That's worth a conversation with government and looking where you might be able to fit into some of those buckets of money.
Alexa, you said, oh, sorry, Evan, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add there, Minister Horner did his traditional, conservative, I say no all the time, finance minister spiel. I would note that the focus on tier funding and other carbon reduction grants was highly profiled in the budget. And there continues to be opportunities through the tier fund and other funds as well. I would say that opportunity has grown in this budget, and if that's your business interest or you have a line into that type of discussion in the energy sector, there's definitely opportunity there.
So in the energy sector, we've seen a shift when it comes to renewable energy regulations. They came out this week just ahead of the budget. There's going to be greater protection for agricultural lands. There's pristine viewscapes, buffer zones. We're also going to see some reclamation securities, and we're still awaiting on final decisions around transmission costs and how they might be impacting renewable energy players. For renewable energy players that want to get into the market, has the landscape changed for them? How should they be approaching these policies now?
I think there's kind of two separate things, right? Like there's a budget document which outlines a fiscal plan and it funds programs, and then there's a policy agenda. And I think that one thing that this government has done, really consistently since Premier Smith has taken office, is they're really transparent about what that policy agenda is. So things like the lifting the renewable pause that you just alluded to, like I think back to when the pause was instated or was put into place over the summer. It's something that the premier herself had been telegraphing for a long time. And so I think that like sort of what Evan mentioned when it comes to things like tier funding, which is obviously the large envelope to help fund projects that will decarbonize and sort of support a clean energy transition, or things like the Alberta Carbon Capture Incentive Program, which was announced over the fall. These are policies that get rolled out in the lead up to budget, and of course, so maybe they don't look like news in the context of a budget. But I think that the policy agenda and the sort of funding envelopes that are available to stakeholders, whether it's in the energy sector or otherwise, I think there's a degree to which these are initiatives that you see the funding allocated in budget, but I mean there's a legislative agenda that's going to be coming up too, right? And so some of the policy initiatives that this government is going to be sort of putting on the table this spring, those may require funding in the context of a future budget year. And so I think, like my colleague Alexa said, taking a longer term view to how you can fit your funding priorities into this fiscal plan is I think the way to win.
Yeah, and I'll add there are ways to influence this moving forward. It's still not set in stone. Like there are a few aspects of this that are a little ambiguous as well. Like when we look at pristine landscape and determining the parameters of what that means for a stakeholder. When you're planning your project, you're laying the outline of what your project's going to look like, it's still unsure exactly what those parameters are going to be. We've been given, distance of kilometers, but what is considered a pristine landscape? So there's still ways to, when you are moving forward and discussing projects and building a project and advocating the government, to still determine how they are going to define those terms. I believe that this will be moving forward within a few ministries to decide what that definition is going to look like. Specifically, Minister of Environment and Protected Areas, they're going to be looking at how do we determine what in Alberta is a pristine landscape and where are we going to give projects the parameters to operate in.
Yeah, and I think this is one example that, voters and stakeholders should really watch, of Premier Smith having to really balance the desires of her rural caucus and those in Calgary, but also the voters, because there is a need to consistently appeal to her rural base, but also those urban voters that are, desiring some of those renewable, the shift to renewable energy in the province. And it's some conservatives as well that are looking for that. And so you're going to see Smith having to consistently balance those issues. And this is just one example of that, but I would suggest kind of continuing to watch for those things and how she walks that tightrope.
This budget also contained a new tax for electric vehicles, $200 a year when you register your vehicle. The rationale behind it is they don't pay the gas tax, so let's get some funding so we can keep up with the roads. What do you make of this? Is this defendable policy or just politics?
I want to jump on this one, Tom, right off the bat, because I found it really interesting, because if you've been following electric vehicle politics and subsidies for the past almost 2 decades, it's been governments saying, we'll give you money if you buy an electric vehicle. And now it's saying, now at least the way the province framed it is, they're saying, listen, if we're moving towards EVs on the grid, that creates a separate sort of infrastructure demand, obviously, and it also means that the traditional source of revenues you get from fuel taxes will soon dissipate, and the government actually relies on those fuel taxes as a key source of revenue to build out infrastructure, to fund programs or whatever. But so there's a legitimate public policy reason to have that discussion about the different pressures electric vehicles put on the system. But it's hard to ignore the fact that there's obviously a political bent to it. There's a large part of drivers out there who look at an EV and think, there's a brand associated with it, and there might be a little bit like, those guys are costing too much money, or they spend too much money on that car. I like my truck with its combustion vehicle. I'm not buying whatever the next thing Elon Musk is putting out. And so there's sort of an interesting, I won't quite go as far to say it's culture war, but there is a component of that where I think the UCP probably doesn't think it's hurting themselves to put this tax out there as well.
Might be in the stump speech, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and Evan, I'll take it even farther on the political side. When I think initially stakeholders may be surprised to see this policy in place, or attempted policy in place. But I think when you look at the difference between conservatives out in Ontario or in Alberta, there are those fundamental belief differences where I would bet if you poll Albertans their thoughts on EVs, people would not be as excited about them, and they see them as a threat to how much they can afford transportation, and that there are different ways that they move around the province that are different from their counterparts across Canada. Whereas in Ontario, you've seen a push from conservative governments to have EVs and have that ecosystem built out. So there is that political fundamental belief difference. And as Premier Smith heads into her leadership review, I believe in November, that's something she's going to want to appease as her voters and make sure that she hears them and understands that their concerns over these types of policies.
Yeah, and I would add, though, that I think I think we'll touch on healthcare at some point here. And I think one note I would make, though, is that people are going to remember when they have to wait hours to get into a waiting room, or when they can't get a family doctor. They're not remembering when they have to pay $200 for an EV. And also, I would argue that those who are already set on purchasing an EV, they're not going to be disincentivized by a $200 fee. So there is the political dynamics there, but I also think in a lot of ways it's going to be seen as a nothing.
If you look in your screen, there is a chat function as well as a Q&A function. We'd love to hear your questions and put them to the panelists. So if you have any questions, stick them right in there and I'll be happy to ask. Alexa, you mentioned the leadership review coming up this fall for Premier Danielle Smith. Now, with that leadership review, this budget does have a razor-thin surplus. We'll see how it looks in the fall. That promised tax cut, it's going to be delayed a couple of years until full implementation. Full implementation, I think, comes in the election year. Just going to point that out. Is there any risk of political instability in the months ahead, do you think, coming out of this budget? Or do you think she's appeased enough in the UCP base that she shouldn't have to worry about any fires coming out of this one?
Yeah, well, I think there are a few of her campaign promises that they did touch on in this budget. When I think of healthcare, education, and general, safety policies and investments, those things were done, and they can say they were done. There were, if you look, kind of generally, increases to healthcare, increases to education spending, post-secondary education spending. There was a lot of concern and push in the campaign as well for building a skilled workforce and job development in the province. They've done that. They've invested in building a couple thousand apprenticeship seats over the next 3 years, and especially when it comes to safety. They're reaffirming their action to go forward with the Safe Streets Action Plan. So these are campaign promises that were touched on. I think they'll get flack, from stakeholders because there's a consideration for population growth and inflation, how that impacts these investments. But I think when they're looking forward to messaging and up until November, they can really push the message that we did touch on these points and we have made efforts to improve on the things we said we would. Maybe, people say it's not what we wanted, but they can say they still did it.
I would add on to this that the leadership review, the last UCP AGM, I think, was around 3,500 to 4,000 attendees. I would anticipate a similar amount, maybe slightly less, with just a little bit less energy pumped up about a post-election victory. So it's a pretty small audience. And what do those people care about right now? They care about the relationship with Ottawa and how Alberta stands on it and how the Premier's positioned the province against Ottawa. This week, they celebrated officially passing their first motion on the Alberta Sovereignty Act. So it's things like that the Premier will spend a lot of energy broadcasting to let those folks who show up to the things like a leadership review that she's got their back. The other thing that it has nothing to do with this budget per se, but it's worth mentioning, things like getting involved in the parental choice discussion and parental notification and all of those discussions that were happening earlier this month. That was the largest applause line at the last AGM. And so those are the types of things that the Premier, I think, will be leaning on. And I think for the most part, she'll probably be seeing a large part of support for her base. So I think from now until next October, November, I think she'll be pushing those buttons harder than you might expect or perhaps for some stakeholders might desire. And on these other things like tax breaks and other sort of like more, I won't say myopic, but more targeted policy items, I don't think she's as worried about how that's being framed with the public.
We got a question from the chat here. We're going to go back to the renewable energy topic. How do you think the new regulations for clean energy will affect municipalities that are trying to encourage this kind of revenue generation and their ability to attract this potential tax base? This has obviously become a very important part of tax base for a number of rural communities. Should there be some pause or some pushback from communities on this fund, or do we think this is going to incent some?
Like one of the things that really stuck out to me in the announcement that they made on Wednesday, lifting the AUC approvals pause, was the role, the really clearly defined role that municipalities are going to have, in the sort of consultation process for the development of new renewable energy projects. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that municipalities, in particular rural municipalities, really drove, I think, a lot of advocacy on that issue. The Rural Municipalities Association has been, front and center. I think, standing up for, a whole host of some of the kind of issues that, the rapid development of renewable energy projects in this province without having kind of a proper plan in place to manage things like end of life cycle for the infrastructure or, land use planning and the balance that's required, especially when it comes to agricultural lands. So, I think that you're going to see municipalities have a much stronger voice at the table when it comes to those kind of decisions. And if you are, in the business of renewable energy and thinking about developing a project, you're going to have to think a little bit broader than just, checking the boxes with the AUC and working with the province. There's going to be like a sort of a multi-jurisdictional approach that's required. And I think the same thing applies to engaging with First Nations. And I think that was clearly spelled out in the policy as well.
I got to follow up on this front. It's not often you see a straight up moratorium or a straight up pause on an industry like this. One of our attendees asked, was this not doing this? Did it pose a risk to her leadership? Why do we think it was a pause for the negotiation or for the regulations to be developed?
Well, I think I'll add that when we saw this pause happen and then the recent announcement, you did see rural municipalities be, excited and agreeing with the announcement and kind of the outcome of it. So, and those are often the supporters in the base who will be voting for Smith and the UCP. So there is that political angle where doing this kind of gives a olive branch and a hand out to those municipalities and those rural voters who feel that their land is at risk from these projects when they're unregulated. And so I think that part of this was her, trying to gain some momentum and support in that area and reaffirm that she is there and hearing them for what they're saying.
I want to ask about, and we'll go back to the finance side of things and the razor thin surplus of $367 million. There are a number of public sector contracts that are due for renewal this year, due for negotiation this year. This type of budget, not a lot of extra money sitting there. Is this going to be a challenge for the next several months for this provincial government? And what can that labor uncertainty, what kind of impact could that have as stakeholders in the political space and in the investment space have conversations about investing in Alberta?
I'll jump on this one quick here, Tom. I think taking a long view of the government's approach on how they frame this budget. Of course, the Premier did a televised address a couple of weeks ago where she talked about why we need to get off this non-renewable resource revenue roller coaster, where this year we've got 17 billion, but if there was a price crash next year, this could have been a $9-10 billion deficit or more. And so she's got a pretty narrow focus on building up the Heritage Savings Trust Fund so that as interest accumulates, it can become a steady source of revenue that replaces that non-resource renewable revenue. So with that being framed, I think the politics moving forward for the next several months through the spring, summer, and fall as they enter these labor negotiations will be their challenge to the public, to their partners at the labor table, to the opposition. What is your plan? If we have a plan to get us off the royalty revenue roller coaster, is your suggestion that we raise taxes? Is your suggestion, and how much, and where should we raise taxes? If folks want 25% increases, which there's merit, I understand the merit for it, don't get me wrong, but those are the types of policy discussions. Okay, if not our policy, then what's your policy? And they'll be trying to flip it back to opponents and critics. Are you suggesting a PST? Is that the solution? Are you asking for healthcare premiums? Those would be the types of discussions they'll be wanting to push back to their critics. And so that, I think, for those watching the political calendar this year, I think that will be something you'll need to watch closely, is how that debate is framed. And the government wants to win that debate because the Premier believes in the vision she's cast. If they begin to lose that debate, then that frontline vision that she framed at the budget, that's when it begins to fall apart. And that idea of making sure that we're storing away money through the Heritage Fund becomes harder and harder to do.
I think that's also a reason why you don't see a whole bunch of like flashy new spending in this budget. It may sound somewhat counterintuitive, but I think this Premier and this health minister have been really clear in support of the fact that it's frontline workers in the healthcare system, for example, that are obviously bearing the brunt of demand on the system. And so like you look at you look at the broader approach that this government has taken to healthcare system reform. Governance changes and shifts in sort of leadership and strategic direction. It doesn't sound kind of all that sexy, right? Like, I mean, like the retail political instincts of a lot of governments would be to throw money at the problem. I think in Alberta, we've kind of reached a point where our collective view as a province is that we're sort of past that, right? Like there's been budget lifts, year over year for healthcare. And I think there's a collective sense that, throwing money at the problem isn't necessarily the solution. So, when it comes to, where the spend is required, I mean, it's no secret, right? Like the government has a number of collective bargaining agreements that they have to manage. And, in order to sort of make good on the promises that they've made in terms of, really improving primary healthcare delivery, for example, it's probably by design that they are taking a somewhat sort of steady approach to spending in order to be able to manage those discussions properly.
A question in the chat here, and I'm going to preface this by saying we've had internal conversations about this. Me as the old news guy with one view on this, and then you guys as the political insiders and people that worked inside government always have a different view of this. But the question is how government communicates the budget often determines its success in the minds of the public. What are some of the ways this government is communicating the budget, and are these tactics successful? And is there anything that can be improved? So I said, we've had this internal conversation, or me, the old news guy, where they announced the Heritage Savings Trust Fund number last week. Is an interesting decision that I thought, because I thought, well, maybe you want to lead the newscast on budget day on that. But you guys have different thoughts. So how do you see and how the government has rolled out this budget? We sure knew a lot about it heading into budget day yesterday. Good tactic, different tactic, and do you agree in how a government communicates and rolls out announcements? Does that have a big impact on how it's received publicly and how stakeholders can approach it?
I think what I'll start off on and adding is that I think the analogy of tying this budget to how a household and a family would plan their finances is going to do really well. It personalizes the budget. It gives your average Albertan a view that, oh, this is something we would plan and do ourselves. And we would look at our household spending, our household income 3 years in the future, and we would say, we can spend here, we can plan this vacation here, we can invest in this for our home, but we need to save here because we don't know what's going to happen to us in 2 years. And giving that perspective really helps them paint the picture of why, spending is constrained, why certain areas maybe we're not as funded as people were anticipating. It's because they're thinking like a homeowner would, and how someone who's getting their yearly income and planning 3 years down the line would think about their spending.
Yeah, and I think as an average voter, though, many may view this as a very boring budget and question the government on what's in it for them, right? If they can't feel the experience of the investments in their community from a new school or increases to healthcare, if that's something that their family's experiencing right now, or if they don't feel like they're ever going to experience the long-term investments into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, then they may have that question in the back of their mind from an overarching narrative perspective of what is the government actually doing for me out of this budget.
I think there's also a sort of a juxtaposition to point out here with the way that the federal government has approached fiscal policy and the consequences it's had for things like inflation and affordability on a national scale. So, I think that this would be a much harder, like the idea of saving today so that we have fiscal capacity for tomorrow would have been a much harder thing to sell in a context where affordability wasn't the top issue for voters across the entire country.
I want to ask about that affordability, because honestly, this time last year, when they were speaking about the budget, there was a lot of talk around affordability when it came to energy prices, insurance prices, and measures being put in place. There's still that language, but it's not quite the same language this year. But affordable housing seemed to have gotten some attention as well. I got a question here in the chat. What do we make of the investments in the affordable housing, and do we think that's going to start setting us down a path where we can start addressing some of that housing affordability issues here?
I don't think there's that is affordable housing is not something you can flip a switch and solve overnight, right? And it requires partnership at all levels of government as well. I mean, I think, you certainly hear the mayors of Alberta's large cities talk about affordable housing as a priority. And it's not just the province that has to kind of step up to the table. good to be allocating budget increase for initiatives like that. It's I think when you kind of look at the broader issue of affordability, this province, and I think this government, the worldview and the sort of like pillars of their economic plan have to do with a low tax rate, right? They've got a low corporate tax rate. They have all kinds of policies to incentivize investment and direct investment in the province. And I think there's a sense that the fundamentals of why Alberta is an attractive place to invest, and the growth that creates. I think there's a challenge in terms of being able to balance how you invest against that growth. And so, it's obviously something you see government having prioritized in this budget, not something you can solve overnight.
Yeah, and I'd like to see how the message around affordability evolves and changes over the next 3 years. I think when we look at the federal Conservatives and the federal Liberals, affordability has really dominated so much of their policy, their messaging, the way you see peer campaigning. It's all based on affordability. I see elements of that in Alberta government and the policies they've been making, but I don't see it, I don't feel it to the same extent as I do their federal counterparts in some aspects. So I'd like to see if they push that further and take this as a stepping foot to then launch a broader message and a greater message going into the next 3 years.
When you look at things like, so a really good point, like sorry, Evan, you look at things like cost of living. I mean, Alberta has an advantage in that regard. And so I think a lot of the measures that you see, laid out in this budget are really meant to preserve that, right? So it's not necessarily throwing money at the problem so much as it is trying to design a policy and a fiscal framework that allow us to maintain that advantage.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that too. Like I think the zeitgeist in the public was, when inflation first started surging, they were just almost like we were all flailing our arms, like, please, just do something. This is crazy. Now that we've, as the public, we've just been enduring it, and there are signs that there's some cooling headwinds on the inflation front, that there's been some progress made. There's kind of the cold reality that, frankly, the federal government, but also the provincial government, we've been spending way over our skis, and that has long-term policy consequences. I might not have this number quite right, but if I recall looking through the budget last night, I think there's almost $3.5 billion of the budget that's allocated towards debt servicing costs this year. There's about $80 billion in provincial debt the government's acquired just over the last 10 years. I think I'm just going to pause on that point too. Like before 2012 or 13, or maybe a little earlier than that, Alberta had no debt and $17 billion in the rainy day fund. That all disappeared, and there's been over 100 billion. We've essentially spent $100 billion, well, even more than that, $100 billion and more in debt and borrowing, and so that has a cost, and so that's the balance that the minister and other the provincial government here. But I think the federal government's starting to realize too, it's running out of pennies it can borrow as well, and so I think the public will just have to realize that fact, and that's the tension when it comes to these public sector labor negotiations and everything else. I think that will really define the next 18 to 24 months in the Canadian political landscape.
When there's a couple of elements of this budget that just seem, when you read it, like very intentional. So the capital infrastructure funding got the same lift as was sort of allocated to the additional investment in the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, right? So a lift of $2 billion into the Heritage Savings Trust Fund, and then a lift of $2 billion into the capital infrastructure envelope. And so, like it's signals like that show, I think this government is really looking to try and strike a balance between yes, there are imminent infrastructure needs, but to Evan's point, anybody who's followed Alberta politics for more than a couple of electoral cycles knows that the debate around how to invest in and then spend the Heritage Savings Trust Fund is not a new one. I think Premier Smith, this isn't the first budget that she's paid close attention to, right? I mean, you think back to her days as opposition leader and the work that she did advocating for things like trying to shore up Alberta's fiscal policy and trying to put us on a more sustainable sort of budgeting path. I think she views this as an opportunity to really sort of plant her flag and fix an issue that a lot of governments have talked about and not a lot of governments have delivered on.
I want to ask about, we've spoken a lot about the government. I want to ask about the NDP. Not surprising actually from the NDP out of this. They say that this is a budget full of broken promises. But what we have this year with the NDP is a leadership race and a competitive leadership race. How closely do people who want to invest in Alberta, want to engage politically in Alberta, how closely do they need to be watching what the NDP leadership race is saying and what the leadership contestants are doing? And should they be engaging with the NDP?
The NDP leadership candidates are a long ways away from having sort of any direct influence over the like budget policy decisions that are made. So, you know, I think looking closely at some of the commitments and some of the pledges that they campaign on and trying to understand how those align with your business's policy priorities, you know, very important to do, right? You know, this is the first budget of what is likely going to be a 4-year electoral mandate for the Smith government. So
Yeah, and I would add, going later into the race, what if the NDP leadership candidates, if they can successfully saturate a certain issue or topic they want to see, there is potential for that to land among voters and for them to think, oh, you know, we actually may want this from our current government. Like, this is actually not a bad idea. If they can successfully saturate that message and push that objective forward, you know, regardless of whoever wins the leadership race and the outcome of that, and still, you know, seeing a strong Smith government, there is the opportunity for them to kind of help this in long term in terms of just the overall party over the next 3 years beyond the leadership race.
Yeah, and as a stakeholder, I always advise that you look at kind of points and opportunities in the year to engage broadly with both the government and the opposition. And so I know in Calgary, we always look to opportunities like the Calgary Stampede, which is an opportunity where you'll see people from across party lines, and it provides this opportunity. So I think for stakeholders, watching those kinds of opportunities closely and seeing where you can plug in to have kind of engagement moments as a stakeholder to engage closely with those that you wish to influence.
One thing I just want to jump in there on that I'd add is that the nature when you're in opposition and you have a stakeholder reach out to you, like they listen and they're sensitive to that outreach, and so you can influence that discussion. And there's a leadership race right now. There's debates going on. The government will be going through estimates where the opposition will be charged with going line through line and questioning them on everything. There's a policy item you're protective of, or that you don't want to get thrown into the partisan fire. It might be worth thinking about a strategy about how to engage the opposition, just to say, hey guys, like, we spent a lot of money here and we'd really like you not to take shots at this policy. We're happy to explain it. They might disagree with you, but it's just if you're looking at your different options for your engagement options with the opposition, I do think I would advise if you're anxious about that type of politicization that you do some outreach.
that's a really good point. Like, I mean, there's an element of you know, engaging opposition where, you know, it's helpful to mitigate risk, right? But then you know, like, we live in an unprecedented era of populism, right? So voter attitudes drive public policy decisions in a way that we, you know, frankly haven't ever seen before. And so being mindful of the way that opposition parties drive policy debate and influence public opinion. You know, it's not a straight line between you know, opposition advocacy and the impact on public policy. But I mean, you know, to the degree that you know, the NDP leadership candidates, for example, are able to, you know, posit and you know, campaign on policies that you know, shift public opinion and actually galvanize, you know, what voters kind of believe in. You know, you could see that begin to impact the way the government thinks about their own policy decisions.
I want to thank the people who've been putting the questions into the chat for us. We've got a number of them. We're trying to get to as many as we can. We've got one about Take Back Alberta. It seems to be taking a position that they're the most powerful organization in the province and have the capacity to serve almost as a shadow government. Have they been vocal on the budget? What role do you think, if any, did they play into this budget? And what role do you think they'll be playing leading up to the leadership review this fall?
Like if they've reacted to budget, like I haven't heard it. I mean, like if
Do you
you
think
want
it's overstated? Do we think their role is overstated?
well, yeah, like I mean, yeah, if you want a personal opinion of mine, I think their role is totally overstated. Like that, they're not the only grassroots advocacy organization in the province or in the country. So their ability to influence something like leadership review is probably a lot greater than their ability to influence, government policy like budget. But that's the electoral system that we live in, right? So our party system is one where when you sign up and get a party membership, you've got a voice in terms of the decisions that a political party makes. And when a government's elected, they've got a mandate from that election to make policy decisions. And I think the degree to which one grassroots advocacy organization kind of influences that can easily be overstated depending on how they present, sort of in the media and on social media. So
I would add here, like I did see a tweet that was put out saying that David Parker, who runs TBA, is supportive of a 25% increase for nurses, fire managers. Like I don't think there's a lot of policy complexity on some of these like bigger policy questions. As I mentioned earlier, when it comes to the sort of the politics around the leadership review in the race, TBA is a lot like a lot of conservative members, and it's important to disassociate like what TBA is and like the traditional conservative value network and that exists in Alberta and how it's traditionally operated. The things that they advocate for aren't too disassociated from what a lot of conservatives in the province have traditionally cared about. They have very strong feelings of resentment about how Ottawa treats the province. They have very strong sentiments around parental choice and education and guarding the family unit, and those are the things that animates TBA activism. And but healthcare policy less so. Spending day to day, maybe there's some who are really passionate about deficits versus surpluses. I haven't seen it, and so I share Bill's sentiments that I'm not sure. I think their influence on government activities is overstated, and I'm not sure they have a lot of like on the if you go line by line in the budget, how much were they worried about TBA when they're going through that? Probably not very much.
Yeah, and I think there's a dynamic between party governance and actual government policy development. I think the relationship between those two is sometimes overinflated between how much impact party governance can have on the development of like a budget or things like a specific policy. So that's something to consider as well when thinking about how TBA can impact what we see this government do.
So I say time flies. We only have a couple minutes left here, so I want to throw just to each of you one thing you're going to be looking for, and one thing those on the call here should be looking for in the next few weeks as we get ready to head through the spring session and into the time that is Calgary Stampede and the meetings that come with that. Anything that you think that they should be watching for in the next few weeks, or anything interesting out of this budget?
Sorry, go ahead, Bill.
I was going to say, like, we're obviously just at the very beginning of the spring legislative session. So we're going to see a number of bills that get tabled, some of which will correlate back to what was announced in budget, some of which won't. The thing that I'm watching for, and the thing that I guess I would advise stakeholders who are looking to engage and impact policy decisions that this government makes going forward, is your ability to draw a straight line between what it is that you are advocating for and how it impacts voters is going to be, I think, probably the most persuasive way of sort of framing your advocacy. So, this is a budget that is, I think, largely, framed around fiscal responsibility. But when you look at the big spends, it has a lot to do with the things that, the citizen services that Albertans rely on. And so being able to think about how what you advocate for impacts regular voters is I think, a key theme for stakeholders to be focused on.
Yeah, I think something that of interest for myself, keeping an eye out moving forward, is the response from your typical stakeholders that maybe historically has some tension with the government. I think of the investment in apprenticeship seats and those general kind of post-secondary and education investments. Historically, in past governments with UCP, there's been tension between those groups of spending and funding, and do they feel supported enough from the government? So I'm curious to see what their reactions are in the next few weeks based on some arguably significant investments in the budget for the education space.
Yeah, I was going to also bring up kind of the broader legislative agenda as well, as Bill mentioned. And then the other piece I was going to touch on is just over the next kind of 6 months, what other kind of broader themes become kind of touch points for this government, and where we see them. Maybe it's not, it's not funding, but it's, policy agenda, and generally where they look to prioritize their time and energy, and how they're speaking to the electorate. We haven't touched too much today on kind of the continued emphasis on fighting back against Ottawa on certain policies. And so I suspect we're going to see a continued focus and emphasis on that. But just more broadly than that, what other things take up the time and energy and oxygen of the political agenda?
And my final thought on this is simply just where the zeitgeist of Albertans are over the next few months, and how that shapes the debate, and how that ultimately influences government policy heading in through the summer and the fall session. And what I mean by that is, I recall early in Premier Kenney's mandate after 2019, a lot of cost-cutting measures came into effect that were, I think it's fair to say that the public reacted poorly to. And then, of course, COVID started, and there was just a general mood of crankiness among the Alberta electorate. I'm curious to see if this beer budget, as framed by the minister, holds as something that Albertans sort of agree with. Yeah, let's keep it simple. Let's keep it light. Let's not do anything flashy. If that wins support from Albertans, I think that will really kind of give the government a sense of confidence heading out through the rest of 2024. If they start to see labor strife come up, and there starts to be maybe there'll be a few threads of where spending is not being allocated, that the public reacts poorly to, and they start to lose the thread on the message and the narrative, and that starts being reflected in polling. I think that will be the test for Premier Smith and her government, if they're able to hold their nerve through that. And I think that will shape how the government approaches its policy agenda in the fall and looking towards 2025.
Okay. We will leave it at that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today for this Alberta Budget 2024 conversation. Alexa, Bill, Evan, Talisha, always great to hear your perspectives. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. This isn't the end of the conversation. If you would like more to learn more about this budget and how it might impact you and your objectives in Alberta and beyond, feel free to reach out to any one of us. We will be happy to have a personalized conversation with you and your team. Also, please visit our website where you can sign up for a weekly newsletter where we keep you in tune with issues happening right across Canada. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. We'll hope to talk to you again soon.